in the name of the greatest people that have ever trod this earth, I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
Right after the Civil War, the United States found itself in an unfamiliar place. The Confederacy was defeated, and this meant around 4 million enslaved black men, women, and children had been granted their long-desired freedom. Their emancipation was made official with the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. In order to be truly free, Black Americans needed to gain the full rights of citizenship and the ability to participate in choosing elected officials. Simply put, blacks wanted the right to vote. The right to vote was central to securing true freedom and self-determination. As Frederick Douglass famously said in May 1865, slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, which meant the task of reconstructing the Union fell on Andrew Johnson. Johnson was a strong believer in the state's rights and, unlike Lincoln, showed great leniency towards white Southerners in his Reconstruction policy. Although he required the former Confederate states to ratify the 13th Amendment and pledge loyalty to the Union, he granted them free rein in reestablishing their post-war governments. This resulted in most Southern states' legislatures to enact restrictive laws known as Black Codes in 1865 and 1866. These codes strictly governed black citizens' behaviors and denied them suffrage and other rights. Radical Republicans in Congress were furious and said that Black Codes were a way to reinstate slavery without calling it slavery. This led to Congress passing the Civil Rights Bill in early 1866. The bill aimed to build on the 13th Amendment and give Black Americans the right of citizens. Johnson opposed federal action on behalf of formerly enslaved people and vetoed the bill. Congress overrode his veto, which was the first time in the nation's history that major legislation became law over a presidential veto. The passage of a new Reconstruction Act in March 1867 launched an era of congressional reconstruction. Over the next decade, Black Americans voted in huge numbers across the South, resulting in the election of a total of 22 black men to serve in the U.S. Congress. This helped to elect Johnson's Republican successor, Ulysses S. Grant, in 1868. In 1866, Congress approved the 14th Amendment, which granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including former slaves, and guaranteed equal protection of the laws to all citizens. Congress passed the 15th Amendment in 1870. This was the last of the three so-called Reconstruction Amendments. The 15th Amendment stated that voting rights could not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Although Reconstruction saw some biracial support in the South for the first time, much of the power in the state governments remained in white hands. Black voters and officials also faced the constant threat of intimidation and violence from organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. Though the 15th Amendment outlawed voting rights discrimination based on race, states were allowed to determine the specific qualifications for suffrage. Southern state legislatures took advantage of this and used literacy tests, poll taxes, and other discriminatory practices to disenfranchise a majority of black voters in the decades following Reconstruction. White-dominated state legislatures consolidated control and reestablished the Black Codes in the form of Jim Crow laws. This system of segregation and oppression would remain in place for nearly a century. In the 1950s and 60s, African Americans in the South focused on voting rights, and this was one of the key elements in the civil rights movement.
I am about to sign into law the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Its purpose is national, not regional. Its purpose is to promote a more abiding commitment to freedom, a more constant pursuit of justice, and a deeper respect for human dignity.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 finally banned segregation in schools and other public places, but it did very little to fix the issues of discrimination in voting rights.
And when we talk about marching by the thousands, we always prepare ourselves for the follow-up. If it is necessary, we are willing and must be willing to go to jail by the thousands in Alabama to get the right thing.
In March 1965, hundreds of peaceful marchers led by Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists in Selma, Alabama, were brutally attacked by state and local law enforcement. The attacks drew unprecedented attention to the voting rights movement. In that same year, the Voting Rights Act, which banned literacy tests and other methods used to disenfranchise black voters, was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. More action was taken in 1966 when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Harper v. Virginia Board of Elections that poll taxes were unconstitutional for state and local elections. The 24th Amendment had already eliminated poll taxes for federal elections in 1964. Before passage of the Voting Rights Act, an estimated 23% of eligible black voters were registered nationwide. That number rose to 61% by 1969. Black voter registration continued to skyrocket in the South, and by the mid-1980s, historian James C. Cobb documented that there were more black people in public office in the South than in the rest of the nation combined. In 2012, history was made. For the first time ever, turnout of black voters exceeded that of white voters. An incredible 66.6% of eligible black voters turned out to help re-elect President Barack Obama, the nation's first African-American president.
Whether you voted for the very first time or waited in line for a very long time. By the way, we have to fix that.
Although great strides were made in voting rights, there continues to be an effort to suppress black voters. In 2013, the Supreme Court struck down a key provision of the Voting Rights Act, ruling 5-4 in Shelby v. Holder that it was unconstitutional to require states with a history of voter discrimination to seek federal approval before changing their election laws. The court's decision allowed a number of states to pass new restrictions on voting, including limiting early voting and requiring voters to show photo ID. The supporters of these restrictions say that these measures are designed to prevent voter fraud. Voting rights activists and critics argue that these measures are similar to poll taxes and literacy tests of the past, and that they disproportionately affect poor, elderly, black, and Latino voters.